In the shade of a large elm tree near Boston Common, a group of 9 unassuming men met secretly to discuss what they would do about this unjust, unfair, and outrageous Stamp Act that has been forced upon them by Parliament. These men were not the most prominent in the city, but they were all businessmen with the same goal: to incite, organize, and manage mob rule in the streets of Boston as protest to the Stamp Act. Hello, history friends, and welcome back to my channel, Historical USA. Here we discuss the people, places, and events that have made America. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and smack that bell so you will be notified anytime I upload a new episode. I just quickly want to shout out our 2 newest Patreon members, Sig and Carla. Thank you guys so much for your support. If you would like to support me in my work here on Patreon, you can click that link below, or you can search for Historical USA on Patreon. And for those of you guys interested in the book club, we have chosen our new book for August. If you are interested in joining, it is also on Patreon. It is free to join the book club. You will get access to just the book club. We choose a new American history book every month to read and discuss, and it's a really fun time. So if you are interested, click on over to Patreon. You can either support me over there or join for free. It is totally up to you, but thank you guys so much. I love connecting with you all over there as well. Thomas Hutchinson was the most hated man in Boston. Hutchinson, a descendant of Anne Hutchinson, was born in Boston and educated at Harvard, and entered colonial politics in the late 1730s. He rose quickly to become a prominent figure in the Massachusetts colony. Hutchinson also attended an intercolonial meeting in Albany, New York in 1754. We call that the Albany Congress, where he and Benjamin Franklin urged that the colonies should establish a continental union that was essentially self-governing, but nonetheless a subject to British imperial rule. In 1758, Hutchinson was appointed lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. 2 years later, he would be appointed Chief Justice of Massachusetts, despite having no legal background or training. In fact, you may remember him from an episode where James Otis and the Writs of Assistance began to form somewhat of a grudge and opposition to Thomas Hutchinson. And if you are interested in that episode, you can click the link here, or you can find that down in the description below. Hutchinson, though, was a very steadfast defender of the monarchy throughout his entire career, keen to respect British laws and strictly follow British orders. Hutchinson's loyalty, as well as his willingness to grant writs of assistance, enraged Boston's legal and merchant communities. He was the highest ranking native-born official in the provincial government. I also want to keep in mind that at this point, when we're looking at the checks and balances of government in our own government, we have Congress, the legislative branch, the presidency, the executive branch, the Supreme Court, which is the judicial branch. Well, Hutchinson was not only a member of the House, the legislature, he was also serving as a lieutenant governor, the executive, and the Chief Justice, the judicial. So he held high-ranking positions in all 3 branches of colonial government, which was something that a lot of people did not like. He also had a tact self of entitlement. He was proudly elitist in his belief that power should devolve to the educated upper class. While he felt loyalty to his fellow Massachusetts colonists and countrymen, whom he did serve for 30 years, he believed fundamentally that the province, quote, cannot subsist without the protection of our mother country, end quote. He would become an increasingly polarizing figure, not only in his role as, again, legislator, chief justice, lieutenant governor, and finally governor. One biographer even remarked, quote, "He was passionately loyal to his community, and he ended up the worst villain in the whole history of the American Revolution," end quote. Mercy Otis Warren, the first historian of the American Revolution, wrote of him, quote, "He was dark, intriguing, insinuating, haughty, and ambitious, while the extreme of avarice marked every feature of his character. He diligently studied the intricacies of Machiavellian policy and never failed to recommend the Italian master as a model to his adherents." Wow. That's a really clever way of calling someone a dictator. And though he was loyal to the crown, it is clear he did love Massachusetts. Hutchinson was also really interested in history and is considered a historian of colonial history. In the late 1760s, he published the first of 2 volumes of a history of Massachusetts and was in the middle of collecting documents and research for his 3rd volume when he caught wind of the possibility of a Stamp Act placed upon the colonies. Now, I think Hutchinson gets a lot of criticism from his contemporaries. I mean, it was a very polarizing time and tensions were very high. But Hutchinson, in his private letters and correspondence, he believed that the Stamp Act should be repealed. And he wrote that he saw no way that the, quote, "government could have conceded to the claims of America without admitting their principle of total independence," end quote. Hutchinson attempted to soften Massachusetts' opposition to the Stamp Act and opposed any inclusion of what he considered extremist wording, eventually passing a more modest expression of disapproval. Now, remember that as news as the Stamp Act comes out, many of the colonial legislatures will send letters of protest. A lot of the legislatures, including James Otis, was very upset with Hutchinson for excluding harsher rhetoric from that letter of protest. And the populace, too, in Massachusetts would see the petition as feeble in comparison to those produced by other colonies. And Hutchinson was accused of secretly supporting the Stamp Act. He was also accused of treachery and betraying his country. Published up and down the seaboard, the Virginia Resolves rallied colonials and ignited a slow burn of indignation that built throughout the summer. The 13 colonies and their interests had galvanized as never before. Demanding repeal, craftsmen and unskilled workers banded together with politicians, lawyers, and merchants in town meetings, street demonstrations, and boycotts of British goods. Now, the Loyal Nine operated in full secrecy. Therefore, nothing is really known about them. Because they were such a tight-knit group of 9 men, the organization operated rather informally and left very little paper trail. However, we do know who the founding 9 members were. That would be John Avery, a distiller, Henry Bass, a merchant, and Samuel Adams' cousin, which is clearly how Samuel Adams gets involved with the Loyal Nine very early on. Thomas Chase, also a distiller. Stephen Claverley, a brazier. That was a person who actually worked with brass. Thomas Crafts, a painter, who also, by the way, was the first to read the Declaration of Independence in Boston. Benjamin Eads, the owner of the newspaper, the Boston Gazette. John Smith, also a brazier. George Trott, a jeweler. And Henry Wells, a shipowner. Some records even show Joseph Field, who was a shipmaster, as a member. Knowing they needed help in organizing an opposition and planning demonstrations against the Stamp Act, the Loyal Nine worked out deals with rival Boston gangs to carry them out. The prominent ones were the South End Gang, led by Ebenezer McIntosh, and the North End Gang, led by Henry Swift, who hated each other and had a gang rival for many years. As Sam Adams and the Royal Nine began to raise the level of tension that summer in Massachusetts, with threats and acts of intimidation aimed at custom collectors, Loyalist politicians, and administration officials, it was Hutchinson and his faction that were the objects of particular resentment, even though they came out and publicly stated that they were against the Stamp Act. But none of that mattered. As Chief Justice and Lieutenant Governor, he had aligned himself consistently with Crown policy. Hutchinson would also appoint his brother-in-law and Colonial Secretary Andrew Oliver the job of Stamp Master, with responsibility of implementing the Stamp Act in the province. Now, allegedly, Hutchinson was not involved in the process of picking Oliver to be Stamp Master, but that did not mean that his opponents would not be quick to accuse him of favoritism and duplicity. I mean, why not? He is the brother-in-law of the Lieutenant Governor. And remember, when I explain what the Stamp Act does, whoever that Stamp Master is gets a little piece of the pie in whatever they collect. So yeah, people did not believe that Hutchinson was innocent of Oliver's appointment. In all honesty, though, the people of Massachusetts, and especially the people of Boston, did not trust anything Thomas Hutchinson had to say. Every attempt that Hutchinson made in support of the colonists and against the Stamp Act was questioned, and his motives were scrutinized by his opponents. By mid-August, tension would reach its boiling point. Protesters organized as the Sons of Liberty took to the street in a very defiant act against British rule. As the sun rose on August 14th, the citizens of Boston were greeted by, quote, something so rare as to draw the attention of almost the whole town. It was no less than the effigy of the Honorable Stamp Master of the province hanging on one of the great trees at the south end, directly over the main street. Behind him was a boot hung up with the devil clawing out. With the pitchfork in his hand, on the effigy's right arm was writ and sewed the letters A.O. Andrew Oliver. On his left arm wrote these letters: "It's a glorious to see a stamp man hanging on a tree." This effigy hung in the manor all day. The mob took the image down after the performance of some ceremonies meaning the decapitation and further desecration of said effigy. It was brought through the main street to near Oliver's docks, where Oliver worked, and in less than half an hour laid it even with the ground, then took up timbers of the house and carried them on the fort hill, where they stamped the image and timber and made a bonfire. The fuel failed, but they immediately fell upon the Stamp Master's garden fence, took it up, stamped it, and burned it. Not content with this, they proceeded to his coach house, took off the doors, stamped them, and burned them. While they was doing this, the sheriff began to read the proclamation of the mob to withdraw, wrote one Bostonian. This was the first large-scale action in Boston against the Stamp Act, and more especially against a stamp master. It was well planned, focused on a specific goal, and carried out very effectively. The Loyal Nine's reasoning was straightforward. Without a stamp master, the act could not go into effect. John Dickinson said it was, quote, the most effectual and most decent method of preventing the execution of a statute that strikes the axe into the root of the tree. End quote. But were the Sons of Liberty done? Oh no. On August 26th, a mob had formed outside of Thomas Hutchinson's mansion. The house was broken into, Hutchinson and his family narrowly escaping, and systematically ransacked. The house's finishings, wainscoting, and other decorative woodwork were effectively destroyed, and even the building's cupola was taken down in violence that lasted the entire night. The family's silver, furniture, and other items were stolen or destroyed, although some items would be eventually returned. And Hutchinson's collection of historically important manuscripts were scattered. Remember, Hutchinson was working on the final volume of his 3-volume history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Many pages of the work were lost that night and had to be recreated. Hutchinson's detailed inventory, reprinted by biographer James Kendall Hosmer, valued the damage done at more than 2,200 pounds, and he eventually would receive over 3,100 pounds from the province for his troubles. Hutchinson and his family temporarily took refuge at Castle William, and thereafter took up primary residence at Hutchinson's estate in Milton. The evening's destruction was not, however, directed by the Loyal Nine. They had strict boundaries regarding how violence could go, and on this evening, those boundaries had been crossed. They repudiated the ransacking of Hutchinson's house. In an article in the Boston Gazette on September 2nd, it was stated, quote, "In some extraordinary cases, the cause of liberty requires an extraordinary spirit to support it. The actions of the 2 evenings proceeded from different motives, as their conduct was evidently different. The pulling down houses and robbing persons, when any supposed injury can be redressed by laws, was utterly inconsistent with the first principles of government and subversive of the glorious cause," end quote. Now, historian Bernard Bailey believes it was on this night that, quote, "force had been introduced into the revolutionary movement in a form long familiar, but now newly empowered to widely shared principles and beliefs. It would never thereafter be absent." This is not to say that incidents of protest had not been occurring in other cities. In fact, we know that riots had broken out in several colonial cities, from Halifax to Charleston, but now force had been introduced as a tool of the masses. On August 22nd, Andrew Oliver informed his fellow stamp master, Jared Ingersoll, of Connecticut his intentions to resign of his office, writing, quote, "Sir, the newspapers will sufficiently inform you of the abuse I have met with. I am therefore only to acquaint you, in short, that after having stood the attack for 36 hours, a single man against a whole people, the government not being able to afford me any help during that whole time, I was persuaded to yield, in order to prevent what was coming in the night. And as I happened to give out in writing the terms of capitulation, I send you a copy of them." 4 days later, Hutchinson wrote to Richard Jackson, quote, "The encouragers of the first mob never intended matters should go to this length, and the people in general expressed the utmost detestation of this unparalleled outrage," end quote. On November 1st, the day the Stamp Act was to be enforced, there appeared in a Boston newspaper a caricature by John Singleton Copley entitled "The Deplorable States of America." The cartoon expressed the emotions of the citizens of Boston who felt threatened by the revenue measures. Some of the actors in it were Minerva, Britannia, Mercury, an American Indian princess, and Liberty. Some of these images were flying Britannia, leaving behind fragments of Magna Carta, holding out Pandora's box to America, saying, "Take it, daughter, it's only the Stamp Act." America, appealing to Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, begs her to shield her as Liberty lies dying at America's feet. The asp that stings Liberty creeps out of a thistle, symbolic of Scotland and the Scotch influence around the throne. Loyalty, holding the crown and leaning against the tree of liberty, sighs that she fears she will lose her support. Above them flies a figure representing France who uses gold to influence Lord Bute. Remember? Lord Bute, one of the advisors of King George III. A boot in the sky whose rays seem like marionette strings, holding Britannia. In the left background are gallows labeled "Fit Entertainment for Stamp Men." On November 5th, the citizens of Boston were greeted by an unusual scene. Ebenezer McIntosh, leader of the gang Southenders, and Henry Swift, leader of the gang Northenders, two bitter rivals, were leading their men side by side down the streets of Boston. These were two mobs that had gone at each other with clubs and knives on Guy Fawkes Day for as long as anyone could remember. The citizens were amazed and confused. What happened? Well, the answer was Union Feast. Sam Adams, with the assistance of John Hancock, organized a series of dinners the night before and encouraged all classes of men, meaning the two mobs, to share a meal together. Some of the Loyal Nine were present and, quote, with heart in hands, in flowing bowls, and bumping glasses, the Sons of Liberty were born. Now, the name you may have heard before in the last episode. The name is presumed to have been inspired by the phrase in a pro-American anti-taxation speech in the House of Commons in February of 1765 by Irish MP Isaac Barr. And if you have not checked out that episode on the Virginia Resolves where I read Isaac Barr's statements in the House of Commons, you can check that out in the description bar below. Thank you guys so much for watching today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed this one. The birth of the Sons of Liberty. We will see a lot more of them in future episodes. If you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe to this channel. Make sure you ring that bell so that you will be notified every time I post a new episode, and we will continue down this road of revolution. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.